My name is Evelyn Blake, 41, and I never expected an old jacket to open the door to everything I'd buried. I was standing in line at the base commissary holding groceries and my breath when a general I didn't recognize locked eyes with my patch and froze. Not just paused. Froze like he'd seen a ghost. Turns out he had. The patch was from a unit that didn't officially exist. Not anymore. And the moment he saw it, my quiet life wasn't quiet anymore. The irony wasn't lost on me. Before I dive in, where are you watching from today? Tap like if you've ever felt the past creeping back when you least expected it. Because trust me, once that patch was seen, there was no going back. Let me take you to the moment everything started unraveling. Back to the silence I carried for 2 decades. And the day it broke wide open. They looked at me like I didn't belong. Like I was a mistake standing in the middle of their polished little world. My boots made soft sounds across the tile floor of the Fort Rainier commissary. Every step tugged a quiet ache through my right leg. I didn't limp. Not visibly. But I felt it. Always. The morning crowd moved around me. Young families with double-wide strollers. Soldiers in pressed uniforms grabbing energy drinks and protein bars. Everything ran on schedule here. Everything had a purpose. Except maybe me. I wore a jacket that didn't match the scene. Old. Faded. Frayed at the cuffs. The kind of thing they'd toss in a thrift bin and forget about. Not the high-collar kind. Not the shiny emblem kind. This one had history soaked into every thread. And silence sewn into every stitch. I caught the whisper before I saw them. 2 young men. Mid-20s. Clean-shaven. Clean minds. Too clean. Looks like she raided a surplus dumpster. Their voices weren't loud. But they didn't have to be. I was the only one in the aisle with gray hair and a jacket that remembered more than I cared to. Probably trying to pull some fake vet discount, one said, not even bothering to hide it. Whole stolen valor thing. Happens more than you think. I said nothing. I just looked at the soup cans. Compared labels. Calories. Sodium. Price per ounce. Some things never change. You do what you can with what you have. The label blurred for a second. I blinked it away. Keep moving. My fingers brushed the scar along my right wrist as I reached for a can. A reminder of what never made it to paper. They kept talking. Laughed when I picked pasta off the top shelf and winced just a little. Shoulder wasn't what it used to be. I kept calm. Controlled. They didn't know. They couldn't. That jacket. The one they mocked. Had been worn by a man who never made it home. Major Daniel Ashcroft. My CO. My friend. He gave the order that saved my life, then stayed behind so the rest of us could make it out. The jacket was his. I'd worn it ever since. Not every day. Not for attention. Not for comfort. Some mornings I'd reach for it without thinking. Just a habit burned deep enough to survive anything. Even Tyrann. I tucked the grocery list back into my inner pocket. But something slipped with it. A photo. Just for a second. 5 figures. Dust. Shadows. Tactical gear. The only picture that still existed. And even that one. Doctored. No names. No insignia. Just blurred faces behind mirrored lenses. I kept walking. Eggs. Bread. Rice. All the basics. VA hadn't fixed my record yet. They couldn't verify injuries from missions that didn't exist. And the money that should have been there wasn't. Tech consulting helped. Some months. When the contract didn't fall through. But Fort Rainier wasn't the kind of place where people asked questions. Unless they smelled weakness. I headed for checkout. Quiet. Calm. Then I heard it. Again. She's probably heading to the VA, the taller one muttered behind me just loud enough. Bet she's got a whole story lined up. Top secret. Can't say a word about it but needs full coverage. He laughed. They all laughed. I didn't turn around. The VA office was my next stop, actually. Another appeal. Fourth one this year. I knew how it would go. I'd slide over the same documents. The ones from DoD records. The ones with blacked out lines and classified seals. They'd nod. Apologize. Say they couldn't help without a standard DD 214. Then I'd walk out again. No further than when I started. They said Spectre Group didn't exist. But I still wore the damage. I reached the front of the line. A cashier looked up. Older man. Retired master sergeant judging by the hat. He didn't say anything at first, but his eyes. They lingered. Not on my face. On the patch above my heart. There wasn't much left of it. Just a ghost of stitching where an emblem used to be. But if you knew what to look for. He said nothing. Just scanned my items like any other morning. I counted out cash. Exact bills. Slid them across. Have a good day, ma'am, he said, handing me the receipt. His voice was steady. Mine wasn't. You too. First words I'd spoken all morning. I moved toward the back corner. Customer service. Needed to verify my address for the VA appeal. Formality, they said. Never seemed to stay in their system. Behind me. I heard footsteps. Voices again. They weren't done. And they didn't know what was about to happen. What would you do? If someone you mocked turned out to be a ghost from history? Someone who knew more than you could imagine. And carried scars you weren't even trained to recognize. I didn't have to wonder. I was about to watch it unfold. Right in front of everyone. But not yet. Not just yet. I moved down the aisle. Slow. Steady. My basket wasn't even half full yet. But the weight of their stares pressed harder than anything I carried. Lieutenants. That's what their bars said. New officers. Bright futures. Shiny confidence. Their names didn't matter yet. But I'd remember their voices. They followed me. Not close enough to make it a confrontation. Just close enough for their words to reach. Think she even served, one asked. Could be one of those influencers trying to play vet for clout, the other said. Saw someone do that last month. Used stock photos to back his story. He laughed. Their voices weren't harsh, just casual. Too casual. That was the part that cut deeper than they realized. They weren't angry. They weren't cruel on purpose. They just didn't care. I reached for a jar of sauce. Felt my right shoulder grind as I lifted it from the top shelf. Didn't let it show. Or tried not to. But pain has a way of slipping through. Especially the kind you've carried for years. Bet she's trying to angle for full disability, one of them muttered. Show up with some fake injury and a sob story. They'll fast-track it if you use the right words. I kept my eyes on the shelves. My grip tightened. Just enough to feel the blood in my fingertips. The insults weren't new. What stung was how familiar they'd become. I turned the corner and stepped into the dairy section. Cool air. Brighter lights. But no escape. They followed. Didn't even pretend to shop anymore. A small group of enlisted troops came through, laughing, joking loud. One of them noticed the lieutenants and snapped to attention with a salute. Morning, sirs. At ease, the taller one said with a smirk, nodding toward me. You get a look at that jacket. The younger soldier glanced over. Looked at me, then back at them. Yeah. Definitely old school. Almost looks real. Almost. The taller one smirked again. Like cosplay for combat. More laughter. I closed the fridge door and moved toward the registers. The eggs in my basket felt heavier than they should have. So did everything else. Behind me, I heard the whisper. Again, classic scam. Probably heading straight to the VA after this. They all do. They weren't wrong. I was. But not for the reasons they thought. I wasn't looking for pity. I was looking for permission to exist. The quarterly appeal hearing was in 2 hours. Same office, same forms, same refusal. All I wanted was medical care for wounds I didn't get on paper. But they didn't see that. They saw an old woman in an older jacket, limping, faded, and they made up their story. Because that was easier than asking questions they couldn't answer. I stepped into line at the service desk. 5 people ahead of me. Slow line. Always was. Every few seconds I shifted my weight, off the bad leg, gave it a break. Nobody noticed. Except them. They were still behind me. Not in line. Just watching. And whispering. A girl behind the counter called next. I stepped forward. Her name tag read Jenna. Mid-20s. Sharp blazer. Professional smile. How can I help you today? I slid my ID across. I need to verify my current address. For VA records. She nodded, typing. Are you active duty or a dependent veteran? Okay. I'll need to see your veteran ID or DD 214. Here we go again. My service records are classified. I have a letter from the Department of Defense Records Office. I pulled the folder from inside my jacket. Same folder I'd used the last 3 times. Jenna opened it. Flipped through. I watched her expression shift from polite to confused. Behind me, one of the lieutenants said louder. Now, seen that trick before. Flash some blacked-out document, ask for special treatment. Classic. Someone in the other line chuckled. Even another employee glanced over. Jenna's smile faltered. I'm sorry, she said. I'll need to get my supervisor. She walked off. Behind me. Silence. Then whispering. Again. She can't even fake the paperwork right. They were enjoying this. I stood still, basket at my feet. Jacket zipped just enough to cover the patch, but not the outline, not the stitching only a few would ever recognize. The supervisor arrived, older, more polished, clipboard in hand. She took the folder. Reviewed it quickly. I'm sorry, ma'am. This doesn't meet verification requirements. These are the only documents I'm authorized to carry, I said quietly. Then we can't process your address update. You'll need to contact the VA directly. That's why I'm here, I replied. The VA sent me to verify with base records before my appointment. A circle. No exit. Behind me, I heard the voice again. This is ridiculous. People like her clog the system for actual vets. Another chuckle. The supervisor handed me the folder. I'm sorry. I can't help you. I nodded. Thank you for your time. As I turned, I caught them watching. Same eyes, same faces. But now a few looked unsure. Not all of them. Just a few. I adjusted the folder. And as I did, a coin slipped slightly into view. Not one you could buy at the gift shop. Not one that came with a certificate. This one meant something. But I didn't explain it. Not yet. Because something was about to change. They didn't know it. But the room was about to get quiet. Very quiet. And everything they thought they understood was about to shatter. I tucked the folder back into my jacket. Carefully. The coin inside. Didn't slip this time. But it didn't need to. I could feel the weight of it through the fabric. The kind of weight only a few would ever recognize. I stepped away from the counter, didn't rush, didn't make eye contact, just gathered my basket and turned toward the door. Behind me, the whispers still hummed. But something had shifted. It wasn't just mockery anymore. There was confusion now. Hesitation. A pause in the rhythm of their judgment. Maybe it was the coin. Maybe it was the folder. Or maybe it was the way I hadn't flinched. I passed the self-checkout. 3 more steps. And then it happened. The doors slid open, and in walked a man wearing 4 stars. General Jonathan Sterling. He moved with the focus of someone used to making decisions that ripple through continents. 2 aides trailed behind him, one reading from a tablet, the other holding a file. "I want those projections recalculated by this afternoon," Sterling said. "Use the raw data, not the executive summaries. And tell Sims to stop softening the language." "Yes, sir." I stepped to the side. Reflex. Automatic. Civilians always move out of the way, especially when men like Sterling walk through. I adjusted the bags in my arm, tucked my folder tighter under the crook of my elbow, almost cleared the space in front of him when it happened. He looked up, just a glance. Routine. Security-trained eyes scanning faces, threats, patterns. But when his eyes hit mine, they didn't move on. They locked. His steps stopped. Mid-stride. The document in his hand sagged slightly. Forgotten. His gaze dropped. To my jacket. To the left side. To what was barely still there. Faded threads. Ghost stitching. Just enough to whisper a name only the right people would hear. His aides took 2 more steps before realizing he'd frozen. Then they turned. Confused. Until they saw his face. And then, everything stopped. The room. The voices. Even the air felt like it thickened. And then General Sterling snapped to attention. Right there, in the middle of the commissary. 4 stars. Full uniform. Saluting me. I stood there, basket in one hand, folder in the other. Frozen. Then something inside me moved. Slow. Deep. Familiar. I shifted the basket to my left. Let the weight settle. Then I returned the salute. Crisp. Clean. As if the years between hadn't happened. "Captain Evelyn Blake," he said. "Spectre Group, Tyran Extraction." His voice carried across the room. Not a shout. Just. Clear. You could feel the silence deepen after that. Someone dropped a basket 2 aisles over. No one moved. No one said a word. "Yes, sir," I answered. My voice sounded stronger than I expected. He lowered his hand. I did the same. The aides stepped back instinctively. Respect. Recognition. Shock. All of it. The 2 lieutenants who'd followed me stood like statues. Eyes wide. Faces pale. They hadn't spoken since he stopped. And now, they wouldn't dare. General Sterling turned to them. Didn't say a word. Didn't need to. Then he looked back at me. "Walk with me," he asked. I nodded. We moved toward the small cafe in the corner. Every step echoed louder than it should have. People parted without being told. The lieutenant stepped aside. Didn't look up. We sat at a corner table, not far from where they'd laughed earlier. I still hadn't said much. Not because I was afraid, but because something inside me was waking up. A part of me I hadn't touched in years. Sterling folded his hands, studied me. "I never forgot that night," he said. 3 helicopters down, diplomatic convoy surrounded. No air cover. No way out. He paused. "You and your team created the only corridor that worked. You bought us time. And saved lives." I gave a small nod. I could still see the heat waves rising from the desert. Still hear the voices on the comms. Still feel the blast wave from the North Ridge. It was never far. Records listed as a failed extraction with full equipment recovery, he said. But I remember. "Only 3 of us made it home," I replied. "I'm the last one now." He looked down for a moment. Then back at me. His expression changed. Something behind his eyes settled. And I knew what he was about to do, but not how far he'd take it. Not yet, Because when General Sterling took out his phone, he wasn't calling to reminisce. He was about to shake the very system that had erased me, and none of us would forget what came next. Not the aides, not the lieutenants, and certainly not me. What would you do if someone in power suddenly believed your truth? After everyone else tried to bury it, you're about to find out. General Sterling didn't hesitate. He unlocked his phone, tapped fast, precise, then held it to his ear. His voice dropped, but not enough to hide the authority in it. This is General Sterling. Priority personnel request. He paused, listened, then gave a code. 5 syllables. Sharp, memorized. You could feel the cafe shrink around us. Even the workers behind the counter slowed down. His words carried weight. The kind that made people sit straighter. I need a full declassification on Spectre Group. Medical operations only. Tyrann extraction. Effective immediately. Silence again. Then he said, override it. I'll take responsibility. He ended the call, slipped the phone into his pocket, and looked at me. It wasn't a look of sympathy or guilt. It was respect. Pure, direct. Your service will no longer be hidden, he said. Not on my watch. I didn't know what to say. For a moment, I couldn't say anything. My throat tightened. Not because I was overwhelmed, because I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Really seen. He leaned forward. What have you been doing since I hesitated? Then spoke. I've been working with a private firm. AI-assisted trauma triage for combat zones. Trying to improve autonomous decision support for field medics. He nodded. The same system you started developing back then, refined, expanded. But without documentation, no one would contract me long-term. Couldn't verify my credentials. Couldn't verify anything. He exhaled. Not out of frustration. Out of disgust. Not at me. At the system. I had no idea it was this bad, he said. It's worse, I replied. The VA wouldn't approve treatment. The DoD wouldn't release files. Every time I asked, I was told to provide proof that didn't exist. His jaw tightened. How's your leg better with therapy? But I've been paying out of pocket. My shoulder, too. Nerve compression from Tyrann. Got worse over time. He leaned back. His eyes scanned the commissary again. The lieutenants hadn't moved. Neither had the tension in the air. I'll make sure it's handled, he said. Properly. Officially. I believed him. Not because he promised, but because of the way he carried the weight, like someone used to being the final answer. But then, we weren't alone anymore. They approached. The lieutenants. Whitaker and Kohler. Their confidence gone. Shoulders stiff. Backs straight. They stopped at the edge of the table. Didn't sit. Didn't speak. Not until Sterling nodded. Then Whitaker stepped forward. Ma'am, he said. Request permission to speak. Sterling looked at me. Let me decide. I gave a small nod. Permission granted. Whitaker swallowed. I want to apologize. For our behavior. It was unacceptable. We judged without understanding. We acted without respect. Kohler stepped up beside him. We failed to uphold our values. And we're sorry. I studied them. Not to shame them. To see if they meant it. And they did. They weren't just embarrassed. They were learning. You couldn't have known, I said. That was the point of Spectre. We weren't meant to be seen. But that doesn't excuse our actions, Whitaker replied. No, I said. It doesn't. I let the silence hang there. Just long enough. Then I softened. Sometimes the most important lessons come wrapped in failure. It's what you do next that counts. Sterling nodded. A lesson worth remembering, he said. They both stood straighter. Yes, sir. He dismissed them with a single word. They turned, walked off. Slower now. Quieter. Different. The room had changed. I could feel it. Not just the silence, but the shift. Eyes that once dismissed me now watched with something else. Curiosity. Regret. Respect. One of the cafe workers brought over fresh coffee, said nothing. Just placed it down and nodded. Sterling glanced at me. "That patch?" he said. "It's barely visible, but I knew it the second I saw it." I nodded. It used to be Ashcroft's jacket. After he fell, I kept it. "He was a damn good commander," Sterling said. "One of the best I never officially met." "He bought us time," I said. "Held the line alone while we evacuated the diplomats." His last order was clear. "No one turns back." "He never made it out," Sterling murmured. "No," I said quietly. "But his jacket did." Sterling looked at it again. The threads. The patch. The shadow of what once was. "Time erased the lines," I said. "But not the meaning." He gave a slow nod. "I want you to come to my office," he said. "We have more to fix. Not just your record. The whole way this is handled." I hesitated. "It's not necessary," I said. "It absolutely is," he replied. "Some debts don't vanish in the paperwork." I looked at my hands. Still steady. After everything. Then I looked up. Straight at him. "All right, General," I said. "Let's fix it." But I didn't know then. Just how far the fixing would go. Or how many others it might reach. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. It never was. And soon, the whole base would know it. What happens when truth finally breaks through silence? You'll see. 3 days later, I walked into his office. Not a meeting room. Not some corner of admin. The real office. Command level. Quiet and secure. The kind of place you don't enter unless you're expected. Sterling stood when I arrived. His aide stepped out. Doors closed behind me. It was just the two of us. He waved me toward the seat across from his desk. A screen beside him showed a loading bar. Declassification process. Real-time. Lines of text and redacted boxes slowly turning clear. "I had to push harder than I expected," he said. "But it's moving." I nodded. He tapped the screen once. Brought up a file. Spectre Group. Tyrann. For the first time in 20 years. I saw my own record. Not a summary. Not a name crossed out with black ink. The real thing. My name. Captain Evelyn Blake. Medical Officer. Extraction Specialist. Mission logs. Injury reports. Personnel assessments. I looked away. Too much too fast. But he understood. Didn't press. "I'm assigning a team to fast-track your VA eligibility," he said. "Medical care. Back pay. Full benefits." I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't want it. But because I wasn't used to being told yes. He opened a drawer. Pulled out a black case. Set it in front of me. I knew that shape. He flipped it open. The Presidential Unit Citation. A new one. With Spectre's patch on the back. "It's official," he said. "Effective last night." I stared at it. Then touched the pin with one finger. It didn't feel real. But it was. And there was more. "There's been an internal memo sent across officer channels," he said. "A lesson report. Based on what happened that day in the commissary." I blinked. He turned the monitor. On the screen was a training deck. Slides. Quotes. Photos from security footage. Title: Operational Awareness and Legacy Integrity. The Spectre Case Study. Your name's in it. Not the operational details, he said, but enough. They know now. Who you were. What you did. What silence looks like when worn on a jacket. I closed my eyes for a second. just long enough to feel it settle. Then I asked him something that had been sitting in my mind since that morning. What changed? He didn't answer right away. Walked to the window. Looked out over the base. I've been in this game a long time, he said. I've signed off on things I'll never talk about. Buried files, closed units. Moved on. He paused. But I never forgot Tyrion. Or who made it out. Or why I did. His voice was quieter now. I never stopped wondering what happened to you. Or your team. I assumed you were gone. That the system had handled it. He turned back to me. But when I saw you, in that commissary, I realized we never made room for ghosts. We just left them behind. His words hung in the air. I didn't need to speak. Not yet. He sat again. I want to offer you something, he said. More than just recognition. A position. A new role. I tilted my head. He continued. We're developing a program. Specialized training for complex extraction operations. Medical, tactical, AI integrated decision support. And we need someone who's lived it. He didn't sugarcoat it. Didn't call it an honor. Or a favor. Just a need. Real and urgent. He was offering me purpose again. Something I hadn't expected. Not after all this time. I'm not a teacher, I said quietly. He smiled. You're not. You're a survivor. And that's exactly what they need to learn from. He let the words sink in. Then said nothing. Gave me time. I stared at the monitor. At my name. Then at the pin still lying in the case. All the years I'd stayed silent. Had been carved into that jacket. But maybe silence wasn't the only way to honor the past. Maybe passing it on mattered too. I looked up. I'll think about it, I said. He nodded. That was enough. We stood. He offered his hand. I shook it. Firm. Steady. Different than last time. This time, I was no longer invisible. But something else was waiting outside that room. Something I didn't expect. As I stepped out into the hallway, I saw two young soldiers waiting near the elevator. They noticed me. And the patch on my jacket. They stood straighter. One of them even nodded. Respect. Not curiosity, they knew. And if they didn't know everything, they knew enough, but it wasn't over. Not yet. Because a few days later, I ran into someone who would remind me what this change meant. Not just for me, but for the ones who would come next. And what she asked me caught me completely off guard. It happened the following week. Back at the commissary. Same automatic doors, same polished floors. But everything felt different now. Not because the building had changed. Because I had. I walked straighter. The limp wasn't gone, but it had eased. Sterling's orders had gone through faster than anyone expected. My VA file had updated in under 48 hours. Med approval. PT referrals. Disability back pay. Already processing. Someone somewhere had flipped a very important switch. And just like that, the world stopped pretending I didn't exist. I wore the same jacket, but this time, it had been cleaned. Restitched. The faded patch over my heart wasn't faded anymore. It had been restored, subtle, low contrast, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Below it sat a new pin. Presidential Unit Citation. Quiet and polished. Not meant for flash. Just truth. And people noticed. The cashier was the same retired Master Sergeant from before. Thomas Green. He looked up as I approached. Gave a nod. Good to see that getting the respect it deserves now. Morning, Master Sergeant, I said. We'd talked a few times since that first day. Turns out, he'd suspected something. Said the patch had a certain shape he couldn't forget, but he'd kept his questions to himself, because in his words, you don't ask unless someone wants to tell you. Today he just scanned my items. Canned goods. Coffee. Oatmeal. No commentary. No awkward pauses. Just quiet understanding. As he bagged the last item, he said something I didn't expect. My nephew's at the academy now. Told me they added a new ethics case study to officer training. Real recent. Based on what happened here. I looked at him. He nodded. They didn't name names. But I figured. I gave him a small smile. Didn't say much. Didn't need to. But as I turned away from the register, someone else noticed me. Young. Late 20s at most. Female officer. Lieutenant bars shining, and eyes. Sharp. She hesitated, then approached. Focused. Determined. "Excuse me," she said. I stopped. Turned slightly. "Yes." She straightened instinctively. "Are you Captain Evelyn Blake? I studied her?" Quick scan. Intel insignia. Steady posture. Bright. Too bright to be casual. "I am." She saluted. Crisp. Clean. Lieutenant Naomi Tran. 103rd Military Intelligence Battalion. I returned the salute. "At ease, Lieutenant." She lowered her hand. But her voice stayed tight. "Ma'am, I've been studying your extraction techniques as part of our advanced operations track. The newly declassified parts of Tyrann have been added to our field manual." That caught me. I didn't flinch. But inside, something shifted. That mission had lived in the dark for so long. Now, they were teaching it. She continued. "Your limited resource perimeter strategy has become foundational, especially in hostile fallback scenarios. We use it during simulations now." I stayed quiet. Let her speak. "There's one more thing," she said. "I'm part of a training dev team. We're building protocols for AI-assisted field extractions, using some of the methods your unit pioneered. We were wondering if you might speak to our platoon sometime." The question hung there. Simple words. Heavy meaning. I didn't answer right away. 20 years of silence isn't something you break in one afternoon. But something about her. The clarity. The drive. Reminded me of someone I used to know. Someone I used to be. So I nodded. I'd be happy to. Within classification limits. Her face lit up. Not in a childish way. In a way that said this mattered. Really mattered. She handed me a small card. Contact info. Then gave another salute. "This one's softer. More personal. Thank you, ma'am. Truly." And then she was gone. Back into the crowd. Leaving me with one thought. Legacy. Not as an idea, but as a living thing. Not a plaque. Not a headline. A thread passed from hand to hand. And for the first time, I wasn't just a survivor. I was someone others could learn from. And I wasn't done. Not even close. Because there was more to share. More to pass on. More than even she realized. And when I opened the old storage box later that night, I found something I hadn't touched in years. Something I wasn't sure I'd ever show again. But that's where the next chapter really begins. Because inside that box was more than memory. It was a key. And someone else was about to unlock it. The box was heavier than I remembered. Not physically, but in the way it made my chest tighten when I opened the lid. I hadn't touched it in years. Hadn't wanted to. Inside were the pieces I hadn't been ready to face. Maps. Photos. Sealed documents. And under it all, the original patch. The real one. Before it faded, before time tried to erase it, I lifted it with both hands. Felt the texture. Rough edges. Thick thread. And memory. So much memory. The team's old tactics manual was in there too. Handwritten notes in the margins. Diagrams from desert drills. Scenarios we ran over and over until they burned into our blood. I placed it all carefully into a second folder, one I could bring to the briefing. Lieutenant Tran had followed up already. She sent me the unit schedule, asked if I'd be available next month to speak, but I didn't want to wait. Some things can't stay quiet anymore, so I called her, told her I'd come in person. No slides, no deck, just the story. She agreed. Fast. Almost too fast. They were hungry for it, not for the fame, for the function. I arrived early. Training facility. Classroom wing. Rows of chairs. A smartboard. Digital maps projected on the walls. I didn't need them. I had everything I needed in my mind. They filed in. 25 officers. Mixed branches. Young, eager. Some looked at me with curiosity. Others with the kind of careful posture that said they knew. Not all of it, but enough. Lieutenant Tran introduced me. Brief, direct. Then stepped back. I took my place at the front. No microphone, no podium, just me. And what they were about to hear. I won't be giving you a lecture, I said. And I won't be showing slides. A few shifted in their seats. Not uncomfortable, just alert. I'm here because your learning strategies pulled from an operation that didn't officially exist. Until recently. That got their attention. No fidgeting. No phones, just focus. I opened the folder, pulled out a marked map, hand-drawn, colored with sand and sweat. This is what we used when digital comms failed. Day 3. Tiron Valley. No GPS, no satellite. No backup. I walked them through the fallback, the extraction route, the makeshift barricade, the comms failure, the storm. The moment when we realized no one was coming, unless we made them come. They took notes. Some scribbled furiously. Others just stared. But they were locked in. I told them about Rodriguez, our tech lead. He rerouted an entire signal relay under fire, using a cracked tablet and 2 spare antennas. Saved the air path. Didn't survive the exit. I didn't tell them everything. But I told them enough. Enough to understand the pressure, the limitations, and the cost. I ended with one thing. I held up the old patch. The original. This didn't come from a museum, I said. This came from the shoulder of a man who died holding a ridge so I could live to tell you this. The room stayed silent. No one moved. And that silence said everything. Afterward, Tran walked me out. She looked different. Humbled. Energized. Both at once. We want to add your footage to the training module, she said. The briefing. The map breakdown. The case structure. I can send a request through proper channels. I nodded. Do it. And if you're open to it. She added the Academy is considering a new section in their tactical simulation library. They want a Spectre scenario. Real variables, real maps. She looked up. You could help design it. It caught me off guard. Not the offer. The word. Design. As if I could still build something. As if the past didn't just haunt, it could instruct. And that made me pause. For the first time, I saw what this was really turning into. Not a debrief, a blueprint, and if I stepped into that role, others might find what I lost, before they needed to pay the price I had. I didn't answer her right away. Because there was someone else I needed to speak to first. Someone who hadn't heard the story yet. But deserved to. She'd lived with a different version her entire life. And soon. That version was about to change. Because she was about to learn what really happened to her father. And why none of us ever came home the same. 3 weeks later, I got the call. Sterling's aid. Brief. Direct. We've located Specialist Rodriguez's family. I didn't respond right away. I had to sit down first. Rodriguez. Leo. The youngest in our unit. Tech genius. Always had a sarcastic one-liner ready. He was the one who fixed the comms under fire, who rerouted the satellite bounce by hand when our gear fried in the storm, who didn't make it out. I had written the letter to his wife. The official version. Training accident. Unforeseen complications. A paragraph of lies wrapped in protocol. Now, after all these years, his daughter would finally know the truth. Her name was Isabel, 26 now. Born the same year we deployed to Tehran. She'd grown up with a folded flag and a censored file, and soon she would stand on a stage and receive his silver star. The ceremony was set for next month. They wanted me to attend. Not as a guest. As the last surviving member of Spectre. I said yes. Of course I did. But saying yes didn't mean I was ready. Not yet. I found myself replaying the mission in my mind. The sand. The heat. The way Leo stayed back with the gear while the rest of us moved. He volunteered. Didn't flinch. Held the signal while the evac zone cleared. I could still hear him in my ear. Just keep going. I've got eyes on you. The last thing he ever said. After that, static. Then silence. And we couldn't turn back. We wanted to, but we couldn't. We knew what that meant. He knew too. That was the cost. And now, that cost was finally being acknowledged. Not with parades. Not with headlines. But with truth. I was standing outside HQ when Sterling found me. He'd just come out of a meeting, uniform crisp, voice calm. He walked over and handed me the folder. Inside was the citation approval. Signed. Stamped. Real. I thought you should see it first, he said. I read the wording. Every sentence felt heavier than the one before. And then I saw her name. Isabel Rodriguez. Daughter of specialist Leo Rodriguez. To receive posthumous award for gallantry in action. The rest blurred. But not because I couldn't read it. Because for the first time, Leo's name wasn't behind red tape. It was in the light. Will she know what really happened? I asked. Sterling paused. She'll know enough. She won't get the full op. But she'll know he was a hero. That he died saving lives. That his sacrifice mattered. That was all I needed. The full truth would always stay sealed. But this was something. A start. She asked if someone from his team would be there, he said. I'll be there, I told him. She deserves that much. He nodded. Then added something that made me stop. She wants to meet you. She read part of the Tehran briefing that was released last month. Saw your name. Knew you were there. Said she wanted to thank you. I looked away. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure I deserved that thanks. None of us were. We survived. He didn't. That was a weight you never put down. No matter how many citations they handed out. But I said yes anyway. Because it wasn't about me. It was about her. And the story she never got to hear. I opened my locker that night, pulled out the box again. Same folder, same photo. Leo's handwriting in the corner of a printed sat map. A joke scrawled in black marker. Extraction or bust. Typical Leo. I tucked it into my bag, along with the patch. The real one. And the citations Sterling had given me. We'd wear our dress uniforms for the ceremony. But I planned to bring the jacket anyway. Not to wear. Just to hold. And maybe, if she asked, to explain what it meant. Not the threads. Not the emblem. But the silence it had carried. And why now that silence was finally lifting. I didn't know how she'd take it, or what she'd say. But I knew one thing. She was going to learn something most never do. That sometimes, the truth doesn't arrive on time, but it still arrives. And when it does, it changes everything. What would you say to the daughter of a fallen teammate? If she looked you in the eye and asked, "Did my father die alone?" Because that's exactly what happened. And I had to decide whether to tell her the whole truth. The ceremony was quiet. No marching band, no flyover, just rows of chairs under a white tent. Family. A few press. A couple of brass. And one folded flag resting on a table next to the podium. I sat in the front row. Dress uniform. Boots shined. The citation pin sat on my left breast, but the jacket stayed folded on my lap. Isabel arrived a few minutes before it began. She walked like someone holding her breath. Navy blue blazer. Hair tied back. She looked younger than 26. But her eyes were older, like she'd spent years asking silent questions no one would answer. When they introduced her, she stepped to the podium with calm control. The kind that only comes from growing up next to silence. She accepted the medal from General Sterling. Didn't cry. Didn't speak. Just held it close, like she'd been waiting her whole life for proof that her father was more than a file. Afterward, she approached me. No handlers. No hesitation. She stood in front of me for a moment, then extended her hand. "Captain Blake," she said, "thank you for being here." I stood. Shook her hand. "It's an honor," I replied. She looked down at the jacket I held. Then back up. That patch was that his eye nodded. Not originally, but it rode with him. The last op. He was wearing the signal rig, held the line after we pulled out. Her eyes didn't waver. Did he know that he wouldn't make it? I paused. Not out of uncertainty. Out of respect. He knew the odds, I said, and he chose to stay. It was the only way the rest of us could get out. She nodded once. Not in approval, not in anger, just understanding. Then she asked the question I knew would come. Was he alone? I felt it hit me in the ribs. That word, alone. I looked past her for a second. Back at the empty chairs. Then at the ridge line in the distance. I couldn't reach him after we left the last perimeter, I said. But before that, we were with him. Every step. She stayed quiet. And I added, he didn't go unrecognized. Not anymore. She blinked fast. Then pulled something from her bag. A photo. Worn. Creased. I recognized it immediately. Leo, in uniform, holding a newborn wrapped in hospital blue. I don't remember him, she said. But I wanted you to have this. I have the digital copy. It's yours. I took it. Carefully. As if the edges might break. It didn't show Tyron. Didn't show sand or war or death. Just a father. And a moment that mattered. Thank you, I said. She looked down once more at the jacket. Then turned to go. But halfway through the aisle, she stopped. Glanced back. I'm studying healthcare now, she said. Nursing. But I'm hoping to transition into med tech. The kind that supports field units, evac support, diagnostics, rapid response. I smiled. She didn't know. Not yet. But she was walking straight into the legacy her father helped shape. I know a few teams working on that, I said. One of them owes your father more than they realize. She tilted her head. Curious. I let it hang. Some truths need space to land. Later that week, I walked the base again. The same morning routine, same crisp air. But something kept pulling my thoughts back. Not just to Isabel. To all of it. To how much had changed in 3 months. And how much still hadn't. I stopped by the commissary. Saw the same young cashier. Green. He greeted me like usual. But this time he added something new. My nephew's class is using your team's methods in their AI training labs, he said. The name Spectre doesn't show up. But they know. I nodded. Progress doesn't always come fast. But it comes. I paid for my groceries and left, walked out under a sky that didn't feel quite so heavy. As I crossed the parking lot, a young officer approached. Not familiar, but the way she moved. Respectful. She stopped in front of me. Nervous. "Ma'am," she said. "Are you Captain Evelyn Blake from the Spectre Group?" I waited. Then gave a single nod. She straightened. Saluted. "Lieutenant Jordan, ma'am. We've been using your perimeter collapse strategy in field sims. I just wanted to say thank you." I returned the salute. Then said, "Keep practicing it. One day it might save lives." She nodded. Then walked away. I stood there for a moment longer, watching her disappear into the base, one of many. But not just a soldier, a student, a carrier of something old. And as I turned to head back toward my car, I realized I wasn't just passing the torch. I was part of something bigger now, a foundation, and someone else was about to make that official. Because General Sterling wasn't finished with me yet, and the next offer he made would change everything again. He found me on the path between HQ and the training compound. Morning sun. Crisp air. Same polished pace. But this time Sterling wasn't walking with aides. Just one officer beside him. Tall. Uniform pressed. Tablet in hand. When he saw me, he stopped. Waved the other officer on. Then turned toward me with that same look. The one that always meant something was coming. "Captain Blake," he said. "Just the person I wanted to see." I slowed. Waited. He didn't make me guess. "We've been reviewing the progress on declassification," he said. "The parts related to personnel training and medical structure are moving." I nodded. Still cautious. Still waiting. "There's been a development," he said. The kind of sentence that carries weight before it lands. He pulled a small folder from his pocket, handed it to me. Inside was a memo. Short. Simple. But powerful. Spectre Group was being referenced in a new internal program. Specialized field extraction under complex threat environments. And they wanted me involved. Curriculum development. Tactical design. Legacy continuity. Not a token name. Not a ceremonial role. Real work. From the ground up. "They're calling it Project Ember," he said. "Fire under pressure. Quiet contained. But critical." I looked down at the paper again. It wasn't just about teaching. It was about shaping the next generation. The ones who wouldn't have to fight to prove their service after the fact. The ones who might never feel erased. "I'm not sure I know how to teach what we lived," I said. Sterling smiled. "You won't teach it from a textbook. You'll teach it from experience. From instinct. From failure and survival." I stayed silent. Because part of me still didn't believe it. The offer. The trust. The visibility. Then I remembered something. A moment I hadn't thought of in years. Tiron. Night 3. We were boxed in on 3 sides. Perimeter sensors fried. Callahan turned to me. Asked me to lead evac sequencing while he held the flank. I hesitated. Told him I wasn't sure I could. He looked at me. Calm. Clear. And said, "You don't need to be sure. You need to begin." So I did. And now? I was standing in that same hesitation again. But I knew the answer. "I'll do it," I said. Sterling didn't react big. Just a single nod. Like it was already done. "I'll have my aid coordinate with you," he said. "Expect the first design session next month." I folded the memo. Slipped it into my jacket. The same jacket. Still worn. Still patched. But now, part of something new. He turned to leave. Then paused. "There's one more thing," he said. A detail that came up in the last review session. I waited. Curious. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small envelope. Handwritten. Sealed with a plain strip of tape. I found this among Ashcroft's effects. It had your name on it. We never knew where to send it. Until now. My throat tightened. Major Daniel Ashcroft. RCO. The man who gave the final order. Who stayed behind when the rest of us moved. He was the one who gave me the jacket. Not with words. With action. With the last order he ever gave. I took the envelope with both hands. Didn't open it. Not yet. I looked up. Sterling was already walking away. No fanfare. No speeches. Just the sound of boots on pavement. I stood there a moment longer, then tucked the envelope inside my inner pocket. Right next to the folder. The one filled with field maps notes and the patch I no longer needed to hide. Later that evening, I sat at my kitchen table. The lights low. The room quiet. And I opened the envelope. Slow. Deliberate. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Ashcroft's handwriting. Crisp block letters. Tight spacing. He'd written it fast. But not rushed. Just one line. No signature. No date. It read, "If anyone remembers us, let it be for what we protected. Not what we lost." I read it twice. Then folded it again. Slipped it back into the envelope. And stared out the window. The base was quiet. But something was moving. Not outside. Inside. This wasn't just closure. It was continuation. Ashcroft had the last word for decades. But now, it was my turn to speak. And someone new was already listening, because just 2 days later, Lieutenant Tran came knocking, and what she brought with her wasn't another request. It was something far more personal. And more unexpected than anything I'd prepared for. 2 days later, there was a knock at my door. Not scheduled. Not official. Just 3 sharp raps against metal. I opened it and found Lieutenant Tran standing there. No uniform this time. Civilian clothes. Still neat. Still focused. But something in her eyes had changed. She wasn't here on orders. She was here for something else. She held out a folder. Slim. Taped shut. "Ma'am," she said. "I have something I thought you'd want to see." I stepped aside. Let her in. She moved like she'd been in this kind of space before. Tactical, not social. I cleared the table. She placed the folder down. Didn't sit. Didn't speak yet. Just waited. I peeled the tape slowly. Inside were transcripts, not classified. Public ones, adapted for the new training module. She flipped to one page. Highlighted. "This is what we're using for scenario prep," she said. "Tiron Phase 2. The fallback protocol." I scanned it. Recognized it instantly. Every move. Every call-out. Exactly how we'd done it. She pointed at a box in the corner. Attribution. Source Spectre Operational Archive Captain E. Blake declassified brief excerpt. For a second, I didn't move. Didn't speak. I'd seen reports. Drafts. But this was curriculum. Structured. Institutional. They weren't just honoring us. They were learning from us. She watched me process it. Then spoke softly. "There's one more reason I came." I looked at her. She hesitated. Then pulled something from her bag. It was a flash drive. Unmarked. "I didn't get this through official channels," she said. "It came from a training partner at Langley. Field Medical Research Division." She held it out. "I didn't take it yet. Why bring it to me?" "Because your name is on 2 of the embedded files," she said. "One of them is a predictive trauma model based on the evac routes you ran at Tiron. That stopped me. Cold. I hadn't submitted anything like that. Not formally. But I remembered. After I got out, I'd done some work for a private AI diagnostics firm. Anonymous input. Trial phase only. No attribution. Just code. Apparently, Not anymore. They're calling it the Blake Grid, she said. It's part of a new triage optimization project. Field kits that use adaptive threat mapping and evac timing based on operator behavior. I took the drive from her hand, felt its weight, plastic, metal, but inside, something I thought had been lost. Contribution. Legacy and data. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Just let the silence settle. She broke it gently. We're not just training with stories now, she said. We're building with them, running simulations that might save someone else the way you saved others. They're learning your patterns, your logic, your thresholds. My voice came quieter than I expected, and they don't even know me. She nodded. But they will. I leaned back. Let the moment breathe. Then opened the drawer to my right. Pulled out a thin box. I'd been holding it for months. For someone. I slid it across the table. She looked down. Hesitated. Opened it. Inside was my old comms coin. The one issued before Tyron. Before everything. Not decorative. Not sold. Earned. I only give that to someone who gets it, I said. She looked up surprised. I'm still learning. We all are, I said. She closed the box. Secured it with care. Then stood. Saluted. Thank you, Captain. I nodded. She left quietly. And I sat there, flash drive in hand. Old data. New direction. Somewhere across the base, training drills were already underway. I could hear the cadence, see the silhouettes through the trees. They were running scenarios I'd written in sand, built under pressure, screamed through static, now digitized, simulated, and alive. But one name was still missing, the last one. One that hadn't yet been spoken aloud in public. Not because we forgot, but because it hadn't been possible. Not until now, and when I walked into the next command meeting. That was the name I carried, because the last piece of our story was still waiting to be honored, and I was the only one left to speak for him. You'll want to hear what happened when I did. The final meeting wasn't on any official schedule, no calendar invite, just a quiet word from Sterling's aide, conference room 3. Noon. I arrived early. Saturday alone at the far end of the long table. Laid out in front of me were two things: the citation draft for Rodriguez, and a second folder, unmarked. Inside were the fragments, the part of the story no one had dared to push forward. Major Ashcroft. Our CO. Our anchor. Our ghost. They'd decorated his name posthumously, but not publicly. Too many redacted lines, too much tied to Spectre. That had always bothered me. Because he wasn't just a commander, he was the one who saw us, held us together when the seams frayed, and made the final call when everything fell apart. He stayed behind so I wouldn't have to. So Rodriguez wouldn't die alone. So the rest of us could live. I looked at his last note again. The one Sterling gave me. If anyone remembers us. That line echoed in the back of my mind as the door opened. Sterling walked in. A couple senior advisors behind him. Civilian analysts. Legal. They nodded politely. Sterling sat across from me. No formalities, just a question. You brought something. I slid the folder forward. He opened it. Read in silence. One of the civilians leaned in, scanning the names. Most of this is already in the Spectre debrief package, he said. But the Ashcroft data hasn't been tagged for public access. Sterling didn't look up. He kept reading, until he found the photo. Our last unit photo. Tyron 48 hours before the breach, Ashcroft in the center. Hand on my shoulder. Rodriguez grinning like a teenager who snuck into the big leagues. The others already gone. I leaned forward. I'm not asking for a statue, I said. I'm not asking for a press release. Sterling looked up. Waiting. I'm asking for recognition. Quiet. Official. Let his name be part of the record. Let future officers know the tactics he taught. Came from him. Another pause. Then one of the advisors spoke. There are implications. Historical, procedural. His last op technically broke contact protocol. He ordered an unsanctioned hold line. I didn't blink. He did it so we could extract a wounded civilian convoy. I still have the footage. I'll submit it under oath. Sterling sat back, arms crossed. Then finally he nodded. He deserves it, he said. The advisors went quiet. No more objections. Sterling pulled out a pen. Initialed the page I'd tucked on top. Submit it through Defense Memo Protocol. I'll expedite it. And just like that, Ashcroft had a path. No parade. No broadcast. But in the doctrine, in the lessons, in the footnotes of training modules, his name would be there. As it should have been from the start. I walked out of that room into the late afternoon sun. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was carrying the past. I felt like I was passing it forward. When I got home, I pulled out the box. The same one. I placed the transcript next to the old map. Then opened a drawer. Inside was a plain black notebook. Empty. Until now. I started writing. Not reports. Not intel. My story. The way I remembered it. Names, sounds, silences. And when I finished the first page, I tucked Ashcroft's note inside the cover, because that message wasn't just for me, it was for whoever came next. And they were already coming. That week, I sat in the back of the academy classroom, guest observer. The new Spectre-inspired module had just launched, AI-driven, live response. The cadets didn't know I was watching, but I watched them. Their choices, their instincts. One cadet paused during the simulation, scanned the terrain, then shifted the evac zone. Exactly like we had. Almost move for move. I smiled. Because that's how it starts. A move, a decision. A whisper from the past. Shaping the future. I stepped outside just before sunset. Sky gold. Air still. I thought of Rodriguez. Ashcroft. Callahan. Every name, every silence. All finally heard. All finally counted. You ask what legacy looks like. Sometimes it's not loud. Sometimes it's a patch on a jacket. A flash drive. A student's choice in a training sim. And sometimes, it's simply this. Knowing that after everything, you were never invisible. You were never alone. And now, neither is anyone else. Maybe that's what legacy really is. Not medals or speeches, but the quiet ways we keep each other alive. Through choices, through memory, through the things we finally find the courage to say. I still don't know why some names fade while others get carved into stone. But I know this one won't disappear again. If any of this felt close to home, I'd love to hear your story. Leave a comment if you've ever carried something that no one else could see. There's more to come, and maybe part of your story is in it too. For now, I'm just sitting here watching the sky go quiet, thinking of all the names we still haven't spoken.